Purim Sameach! How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday. Erev Shabbos, Purim. Have not started imbibing today, but feeling the Purim spirit, a time of tremendous joy. Let's light up the darkness with a new wisdom candle. Oh, come on. Purim is all about recognizing the unseen hand of the Holy One in our lives. So often we can't see it until we look back and we realize, oh, that thing that was terrible turned out to open a door that never would have opened otherwise. That thing that looked so good, yeah, it wasn't so good in retrospect. But there was always a guiding hand. It's a matter of faith that God is guiding the events all the time. We can't always see it, but especially when times are tough, if we have that faith that there's a reason, there's a purpose for all of these difficulties, and with God's help, we'll see it in the end, as certainly turned out in the story of Mordecai and Esther, which we read in the book of Esther, which on Purim it's one of the 5 Megillahs, right? So when we say the whole Megillah, the Megillah, right? It's the Megillah. The Megillah refers to, there are 5 books in the Bible that are known as Megillahs, but the most famous certainly is the book of Esther, which we read today on Purim. Who's in the house? Yehudit in South Carolina, wishing everyone a restful and rejuvenating Shabbos. Bill in Mid-Missouri, Renee in Indiana, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Sharon in New Jersey, Yehudit, and Lorraine. And everybody's wishing everybody a Purim Sameach, beautiful and good Shabbos. Nancy is still at work on a Friday at noon, I guess 3 p.m. by you in North Carolina. Tom in PA. Gordo, not in Scotland, but in Tel Aviv. Wonderful, Gordo. Oh, you should be blessed with a beautiful, uplifting, and meaningful trip in the Holy Land. And, let me open that window over there. Come on the YouTube side, Ella in Southern California. Welcome. Okay. Yesterday's daf was challenging about all these relatives who bring one for the crime of lewdness, etc. A man with a mother and a man with his wife and her mother, his wife and her daughter. Today, Mishna number 2, here in chapter 9 in Tractate Sanhedrin. Our daf is page 77. We're going to open towards the bottom of page 76b. Fascinating page here. We're going to be talking about the laws of the murderer. And when is a murderer liable for committing murder so that a court would execute him. And when is the murderer not going to be liable to execution by an earthly court, even though he did something that resulted in somebody else's death? And this is going to be very much about causation, right? Causation. Did this person directly cause the death in such a way that an earthly court can step in, find him guilty, and execute him? Or was there just one step of removal in the chain of causation where we're not going to have, the earthly court will not be the one to mete out the punishment, and will rely on the heavenly court to do that, whether in this world or the next? So the basic premise always, as we've seen so often, is that while the Torah does hold that for certain crimes, the punishment is execution, and there are 4 kinds of execution, as we've discussed a bunch of times: stoning, decapitation by the sword, burning by pouring molten lead down the throat, burning, stoning, decapitation, and strangulation, where a scarf is wrapped around the neck and pulled. And so they're all death penalties, but they're understood to have different degrees of severity. Not so much in the pain that they cause, but how much they mangle the corpse afterward. At any rate, as we've seen over and over again, the sages are going to always rule very stringently, in the sense that they're going to limit the powers of a court, of an earthly court, to impose a death penalty, right? We have to be so sure that the person caused the crime and that that crime is covered by the laws of the Torah. And if there's any doubt, we're just not going to impose the death penalty. Now, it's a very different society that we're talking about. We have to keep that in mind constantly, because it's rough. It's rough. I mean, God forbid you're the victim of a violent crime, or a loved one in your family is a victim of such a crime, whether a murder or rape or some other kind of violence. And the sages are just not going to impose a death penalty, unless all of the conditions are met. So very often, it's like the perpetrator is going to get away with it. And that's really rough, because in Talmudic times, in biblical times, prison didn't really exist the way that it exists now. Prison is kind of the default punishment for basically all major crimes in our society. Certainly in medieval times, you had castle type prisons where people might end up in prison for a very long time. The Romans, I'm sure, had prisons, but that was not such a common thing. There were local, authorities, non-Jewish authorities, that had dungeons where they might throw a person in the dungeon, often until the noble could be bribed to release the person. And perhaps it was more about debt than actually maintaining the laws. But prison was not the go-to punishment, right? So, and the Torah really never speaks about imprisonment at all. It's basically, is the crime so severe that we're going to execute the perpetrator? Is there going to be a flogging, which the Torah doesn't speak about too much, is more a rabbinic penalty for violating laws of the sages or violating Torah prohibitions? Or are there going to be damages paid, right? But it's very much a very pious society that is really asking the question, okay, is the punishment for this crime, has it been handed to us? Has basically God entrusted us to mete out the punishment for this crime, and we're going to remove this individual from the world through a death penalty? Or are we going to rely on the heavenly court, right? Are we going to rely on God's sort of hidden hand? Good discussion for Purim. Are we going to rely on God's hidden hand in the affairs of humankind to ultimately mete out that punishment? And this is why you have the very colorful and cryptic scene described in Pirkei Avos, where the great sage Hillel finds a skull floating in water. I was discussing this with my study partner the other day. Does a skull float? Like just a human skull? Like all the flesh is gone from it. Would it float? Like, I don't think so, right? I think it would sink. Somebody can help me out with that. But at any rate, he found it floating. And he said, to the skull, because you drowned others, you were drowned. How could he know that, right? How could he possibly know that just looking at this skull that he found in the water, that this was the skull of a person who was drowned, and that he ended up being drowned because he drowned someone else? This is more, I think, an expression, absent other circumstances. That's how Yitz Greenberg interprets that there were other circumstances. It was a place where it was known that criminals would dispatch other criminals. But absent other facts like that, I think it's more a statement of faith that, there are some crimes that humans are not going to be able to attend to and punish, but we have faith that God in heaven above will. Skulls do float, says Bill. Human bones are buoyant. Well, there you go. Thank you. Good to know. Good to know. Apropos of nothing, I'll just share that I was talking today with a documentarian who made some movies about eco-terrorists and protecting the seas from illegal whaling and trawling. And I said to him, you might, I wonder if you're familiar with this story that I heard once when I was at a film festival at Lake Tahoe. And one of the guys driving me around told me that there's all these colorful stories floating around Lake Tahoe. There are casinos there and whatnot. And it's one of the deepest lakes in the world, if not the deepest lake in the world. And if you remember, from a long time ago, there was a guy who made underwater documentaries called Jacques Cousteau, very famous. His son Jean Cousteau also went in that family business. And he showed up at Lake Tahoe with all his trucks and submersibles and cameras, and they were going to make an underwater documentary about Lake Tahoe. And, they spent who knows how many thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to get all the equipment up there to Lake Tahoe. First night, they're in the hotel. They're going to go out the next morning and dive in. And, the director of the documentary in his suite gets a call from the mob, like for real the mob, and says, hey, you go down in that lake, you ain't coming out. Why? Because apparently the mob, the mafia, had disposed of many bodies in Lake Tahoe. And at that tremendous depth and very low temperature and high pressure, apparently those bodies are probably pretty well preserved. And, the mob didn't want those bodies being found and being brought up. So, apropos what Bill said, I'm sure those bodies do float. And they're probably being held down by, chains and cinder blocks. And you could almost imagine a little forest of mob victims all, vertical with their feet being held down at the bottom of Lake Tahoe. Grim image. Okay, let's get back to work. And let me just mention, we will not have class tomorrow night, Saturday night, nor Monday or Tuesday, because I'm on this trip for Guns N' Moses to play at the Boca International Jewish Film Festival. I think there's just a few seats left for the Sunday afternoon screening at 2 o'clock. If you're in Florida, in the area, would love to see you there. Okay, in this chapter 9 in Tractate Sanhedrin, where we're talking about some death penalties, and now specifically we're going to be talking about the penalty of a murderer. Let me just read to you the verses from the book of Numbers, chapter 35, verses 16 through 21. But if he struck him with an instrument of iron so that he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. And if he struck him with a stone in hand, by which a man may die, and he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. Or if he struck him with an instrument of wood in hand, by which a man may die, and he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. Now, right away, since we've been studying together for a long time, the 3 examples should raise our antenna. Why 3 examples? It could have said, If a man strikes another man, whether with his hand or with an object, and that man dies, he's a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. Why do we need to hear about iron, stone, and wood? Let's lodge that in the back of our minds. The murderer shall be put to death. The blood redeemer shall himself put the murderer to death. Now this is already, wait, what? Now that's an extrajudicial proceeding, right? The blood redeemer, that's the closest relative of the victim. Now we know that the blood redeemer has a right to kill the manslaughterer until the manslaughterer reaches the city of refuge. But here, are we talking about the manslaughterer, the one who committed a negligent homicide, or are we talking about a willful murder, an intentional murderer? Maybe that's not clear. You can strike somebody with an iron object. Were you a manslaughterer or were you an intentional murderer? If I hit you in the head, God forbid, with a metal pipe, and I clearly did it on purpose, and you die, yeah, I'm an intentional murderer. If I'm trying to hammer something, a nail, with my my iron pipe, and on my backswing, I hit somebody behind me that I didn't know was there, well, if I should have known someone was there, then I'm negligent, and I'm the negligent homicide. I'm the manslaughter. I have to flee to a city of refuge. But if there was no reason for me to think there was somebody there, then it sounds like just a sheer accident, right? Circumstances beyond my control, and I would be fully exempt. Those are some of the issues that are going to come up here. But does the blood redeemer have a role in the case of an intentional murder? Right? The intentional murder, that needs to come before a beis din, before a rabbinic court, and they determine the person's guilt. What does the blood redeemer have to do with it? Right? He is not just willy-nilly charged with enforcing these laws. The court has to do that. But maybe this is a little bit, from the real world, where there wasn't so much a system of courts of law and police forces and prisons, etc., and families took care of business. You killed one of ours, we're going to go kill the guy who killed us, And maybe a blood feud begins that way, maybe it doesn't. But they weren't relying on the police, which didn't exist, to come and take care of business. Let's keep reading. And I have read elsewhere that in the case of an intentional murderer where the death penalty is going to be carried out, is going to be the case is going to be tried by a rabbinic court, and they will sentence a person to death, and then it's going to happen with let's say a decapitation. The punishment of a murderer is decapitation by the sword. Well, who's actually going to wield the sword? Now we might give that sword to the blood redeemer. In fact, that was preferable, and that would explain the blood redeemer shall himself put the murderer to death. But the verse goes on, when he encounters him, he shall put him to death. And if he thrust him of hatred or hurled at him any item lying in wait, and he died, or in enmity he struck him with his hand, and he died, the assailant shall be put to death. He is a murderer. The blood redeemer shall put the murderer to death when he encounters him. So sounds like the blood redeemer has a very strong role, not just in the case of the negligent homicide, the manslaughter, but also in the case of willful, intentional murder. That's on the surface level. Initial reading. Maybe we're not reading it correctly. We're going to have to stay tuned on that. Okay. Now let's get back to where we are. Oops. Okay. Here we go. Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 9, picking it up on page 76b. And these are the transgressors who are killed by decapitation in the implementation of the court-imposed death penalty: the murderer and the residents of an idolatrous city, all of whom engaged in idol worship. Now the Mishnah elaborates, in the case of a murderer who struck another with a stone or with iron, or held him in the water or in the fire, like drowned him or put him, in a fire, and the victim could not extricate himself from there, and he died, so the murderer is liable to be executed. if one pushed another into the water or into the fire, and that person could have extricated himself from there, but failed to do so, and he died, then the one who pushed him is exempt from punishment by a court, right? By an earthly court. Perhaps he'll be liable at the hands of a heavenly court, as he caused the death, but he did not actually kill the victim. And for the same reason, if one set a dog against another and the dog killed him, or if one set a snake against another and the snake killed him, the one who set the dog or the snake is exempt from punishment. If he embedded the snake's fangs into another and caused the snake to bite him and kill him, Rabbi Yehuda deems him liable to be executed, as he is a murderer. And the rabbis exempt him, as they maintain that the cause of death was indirect. Now the Gemara. So the verses state, with regard to a murderer, and if he struck him with a stone in hand by which a man may die, or if he struck him with an instrument of wood in hand by which a man may die, and he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. Now, the term in hand, this indicates that one is liable for murder only if he utilized a stone or a wooden instrument that was of at least a certain measure. Right? If I hit you, God forbid, with a baseball bat and you die, so anyone would say, well, yeah, and that was foreseeable that I hit someone in the head with a baseball bat, that would kill him, and so I'm a murderer. But if I hit somebody with a popsicle stick, right? Remember those popsicle sticks? You know, about this, very lightweight. You can't hurt somebody with a popsicle stick. You know, so if I hit you with a popsicle stick and it turned out, this is like from law school, right? Eggshell skull rule, that somehow the person had some kind of vulnerability, and through it, it's kind of a freaky thing that I hit him with a popsicle stick expecting nothing to happen, but the person actually died. You can't say that I'm a murderer, right? Because no one would have foreseen that that kind of a stick would cause that kind of an injury. And so somewhere between a popsicle stick and a baseball bat, you know, maybe is a stick, you know, like the handle of a hammer without the iron piece of the hammer, like just kind of a stick, you know, about this big and kind of heavy, you know, and you hit somebody with that, you know, would you think that that is going to cause a fatal wound? Probably not. It's a little bigger, a little heavier. It's just going to become questionable. That's going to be part of the deliberations of the court if such a thing happened. So Shmuel says, for what reason was the term in hand not stated with regard to the iron instrument? As it is written, but if he struck him with an instrument of iron, so that he died, etc., he is a murderer. So the reason is that an iron instrument of any size kills. And this is also taught in a Baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, it is revealed and known before he who spoke and the world came into being, that an iron instrument of any size kills. Therefore, the Torah did not provide a measure for it. And the Gemara comments, and this statement applies only when the murderer stabbed him with an iron instrument. But in a case where the murderer struck another with an iron instrument, he is liable only if the instrument was at least a certain measure capable of causing death. Right? So if you stabbed, you know, even with a thin iron rod, okay, everyone could see how that would cause death. But if you took a thin iron rod, you know, maybe like the size of this pen, maybe a little longer, and you hit somebody with it, sure, it could kill. Is it foreseeable that it would? Is it like certain that striking with somebody like that, you know, would cause serious bodily damage? Maybe. Especially if it even becomes a little bit lighter, it would be something to deliberate. Now, the Mishnah taught, or held him in the water, and that other person died. The murderer is liable. Okay, so wicked person, you know, holds somebody's head underwater until they drown. That's pretty clearly murder. And the sages agree. The murderer is liable. Now, the Gemara comments, the first clause of the Mishnah taught a novel element, and the latter clause of the Mishnah taught a novel element. The first clause teaches this novelty. even though it was not he who pushed the individual into the water, since he held the victim and the victim could not extricate himself from there and he died, the one who held him in the water is liable to be executed, right? If I'm holding somebody's head under the water, well, maybe I didn't push him in the water. Maybe somebody else pushed him in the water. Now he's trying to get to the side of the pool and get out. And I hold his head down. So I'm the murderer, even though I didn't push him in the water initially. And the latter clause teaches us a novelty also. Even though he pushed the individual in the water, since the victim could have extricated himself from there, but failed to do so, and he died, the one who pushed him is exempt from punishment. Because when I pushed him in the water, I didn't think that was going to kill him. The normal thing is people fall in the water and they swim to the edge and get out. Didn't work out that way, but my action was not predictably a murder. So the Gemara asks, from where do we derive that one who held another in the water is liable to be executed? Shmuel says it is derived from a verse. As the verse states, or in enmity, he struck him with his hand and he died, the assailant shall be put to death. He is a murderer. Numbers 35:21. So the phrase, or in enmity, serves to include one who confines another in a place where he cannot survive. Here's an example. There was a certain man who confined the animal of another in a place in the sun, and the animal died from exposure to the sun. Ravina deemed the man liable to recompense the owner, as though his action caused the death of the animal. Makes sense. God forbid you lock a child in a car on a hot day. That child certainly can die. Now, if a parent does that, that wasn't the intention. It was certainly negligent. But now we're talking about with the animal, right? You're not going to be punished as a murderer for killing an animal. With the animal, we're talking about, are you liable to pay damages? So if you leave an animal exposed in the sun, tied to a tree where it can't get to water, or there's not going to be tied to a stake and there's not going to be shade there, and you leave it there for a few days, predictably that animal is going to die of dehydration, right? So Ravina says, obviously foreseeable, you owe damages to the owner of the animal. But Rav Acha bar Rav deemed him exempt from recompensing the owner, as it was not his action that caused the death of the animal. At the time that he tied the animal to the stake, the animal was alive. He certainly could have survived there for a few hours. Maybe there was an expectation that somebody else would come and release the animal, or he was going to. Wasn't intending to kill him. Circumstances changed. Who knows? Maybe in fact, there was a tree there providing shade. And what he didn't know was that, a lumberjack came along and cut down that tree, and now the animal is exposed. So there's a break in the causation, according to Rav Acha bar Rav. Now the Gemara elaborates. Ravina deemed him liable to recompense the owner of the animal, and he derived it by means of a kal v'chomer inference. Just as with regard to a murderer, where the Torah did not render the legal status of one who kills unwittingly, meaning negligently, and that one is exiled, the manslaughterer, and his fate is not like that of one who kills intentionally, who is executed. And the Torah did not render the status of one who kills due to circumstances beyond his control. That's the accidental killer, who is exempt from punishment, and his fate is not like that of one who kills with intent, the intentional murderer, who is executed. So nevertheless, the Torah rendered one who confines another in place where he cannot survive liable to be executed, even though he did not perform an action with regard to damage, where the Torah rendered the legal status of one who causes damage unwittingly like that of one who causes damage intentionally, and the status of one who causes damage due to circumstances beyond his control like that of one who causes damage with intent. Why? Because one is always responsible for damage that he caused. Right? If I, lit a fire, and that fire, spread and burned down the house next door, I'm going to be liable. There's much fewer questions of causation when it comes to paying for the house that ended up burning down because of a fire that I started than there would be when we're talking about someone died, and now we're saying, am I liable to be executed? Am I liable to be exiled? Or am I going to be exempt? Those questions are analyzed, with a different system of analysis than where the question is not, whether I'll be killed or exiled, but rather whether I owe damages. Different burden of proof for monetary damages versus, criminal liability. And now we're on page 77a. Now the Gemara explains the conflicting opinion. Right? Rav Acha bar Rav said the man is exempt who tied the animal to a stake and it ended up dying from dehydration. He exempts the one who confined the animal in the sun from recompensing the owner. Rav Misharshia said, what is the reason for the opinion of Rav Acha, the father of my father, who exempts him from payment? The reason is that the verse states, or in enmity he struck him with his hand and he died. The assailant shall be put to death. He is a murderer. So the phrase, he is a murderer, restricts the liability of one who confines another. It is in a case of a murderer that the Torah renders for us one who confines another liable to be executed. But in the case of damage, the Torah does not render for us one who confines the animal of another liable to recompense the owner, as it was not his direct action that caused the damage. The son killed the animal. Tying him there wasn't really the direct cause, according to that analysis. Rava says, if one bound another and he died of starvation, he is exempt from liability to receive a court-imposed death penalty, as it was not his action that caused the death of the victim. Even if the victim was hungry when he was bound, the starvation that caused his death ensued at a later stage. The one who bound him is liable to be punished by the heavenly court. We're not saying this is permitted. We're not saying that this is okay. But we're saying that the causation is sufficiently attenuated that we are not going to step in as an earthly court and kill a man. Now, even though his action ended up resulting in the death of another man, the causation wasn't strong enough that we're going to step in and kill a man, right? And execute the one who bound this other guy. And Rava says, if one bound another in the sun and he died of the heat, or in a cold place and he died of exposure, then he is liable to be executed, right? So in other words, my action is the same. I tie up a person and leave him there. But if I leave him there and he ultimately starves to death because he was tied up, I'm not going to be liable for murder at the hands of an earthly court. If I tie up this man and leave him sitting there, but he ends up dying because of the sun and overheating in the sun, because I left him in the sun, then according to Rava, I am liable, right? Because the causation is less attenuated in this first case. Why? Because when I leave him in the sun is already striking him. When I bound him here and left him there, starvation had not already set in, right? He's not starving the moment I leave him there. That's going to come much later. And there's a lot of things that could have stopped the death of this man before he actually starves to death. But if one bound another in the sun and he died of the heat, or in a cold place and he died of exposure, so the one who bound him is liable to be executed, because from the moment that he bound him, the victim began dying. But if one bound another in a place that at that time was not exposed to the sun or the cold, even though ultimately the sun would arrive at that place, or ultimately the cold would reach that place, he is exempt from execution, as when he bound the victim, the future cause of death was not yet present. And Rava says, if one bound another before a lion, he is exempt from execution, since perhaps the lion will choose not to prey on the victim. It was not his action that caused the damage. It's the lion who kills him. If he bound another before mosquitoes, he is liable to be executed, as inevitably the mosquitoes will bite him until he dies. Rav Ashi says, even if he bound an individual before mosquitoes, he is exempt from execution, as the mosquitoes who were there when he bound the individual are not necessarily the ones who killed him. Rather, those mosquitoes might have left and these mosquitoes came. Therefore, this case is comparable to the case where one bound another in a place where the sun or the cold would ultimately arrive but was not yet there when he bound him. And it was stated that there is a dispute among the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, with regard to one who overturned a vat upon another, and he died of suffocation. Or he breached plaster that was covering a roof, and the lack of a ceiling caused another to die of exposure. Rava and Rabbi Zera disagree. One says that he is liable to be executed, and one says that he is exempt from execution. So the Gemara suggests, conclude that Rava is the one who says that the perpetrator is exempt from execution. As Rava says, if one bound another and he died of starvation, he is exempt from execution, as it was not his action that caused the death of the victim directly. And the Gemara rejects that suggestion. On the contrary, you should say that it is Rabbi Zera who says that the perpetrator is exempt, right? In this case where if you put a vat over someone, like it's almost like, for whatever reason, you were able to enclose him in a place with limited oxygen, and then ultimately he ran out of oxygen and suffocated. Or this person, was like whatever, sleeping in the winter, and you penetrated the cabin that he's in while he's asleep, and he ends up freezing to death. Perhaps not so dissimilar to that strange case of those Kansas City Chiefs fans, right? They got together, they were partying, and 3 of them went outside and ended up freezing to death. What happened? Who is to blame for that? Not so clear. Now, so on the contrary, conclude that Rabbi Zera is the one who says that the perpetrator is exempt. Why? Because Rabbi Zera says, with regard to this individual who took another into a hermetically sealed house of marble, and he kindled a lamp for him, and the man died of the fumes. So the perpetrator is liable to be executed. So it's interesting, if you're putting somebody in a sealed room, the air can't move in and out. But there's enough air in that room that the guy could survive for quite a while. But then you light an oil lamp in that room. And that oil lamp is going to hasten, the using up of the oxygen. And now this guy ends up suffocating in that sealed room. So it sounds like if you just locked him in a sealed room and he ended up suffocating, isn't that enough? Certainly if you hastened his death by putting an oil lamp, you're the murderer. That's what Rabbi Zera says, right? The perpetrator is liable to be executed. Now, one may infer that the reason he is liable to be executed is because he kindled a lamp. But if he did not kindle a lamp for him, then no, he would not be liable, although the victim would have ultimately died even without the lamp. So apparently Rabbi Zera also maintains that the perpetrator is liable only if the perpetrator's action caused the death, or at least caused the process of dying to begin. This case is identical to the case of the overturned vat. So the sages say, in the case there where one confines another in a house of marble without a kindled lamp, the atmosphere does not begin to cause suffocation at the time of the perpetrator's action, because the room is sufficiently large to enable the individual to breathe. But here in the case where one overturns a vat upon another, in a situation, right, where you're just going to very much limit the amount of oxygen that is available to him, then even without a kindled lamp, the atmosphere begins to cause suffocation at the time of the perpetrator's actions. And therefore, the two cases are not comparable. And it is Rava who exempts the one who overturned the vat upon another. Now we're on page 77b. Now the Gemara cited a mnemonic for the laws that follow with regard to causing the death of another. If you were memorizing the Gemara, this would help you remember. Ladder, shield, herbs in a wall. What is this? What are they reminding us of? First case, Rava says, in a case where one pushed another into the pit, and there was a ladder in the pit that would enable him to emerge from it, and another individual came and removed the ladder. All right, let's start there. You push somebody into a pit. Now, if he can't get out of that pit, he's going to die. But at the time that you pushed him in the pit, there's a ladder in the pit. He can get out. Have you committed murder when you push him in? Sounds like pretty clearly not. Somebody else comes along and takes the ladder. Has he caused the death of the person who's now stuck in the pit, never gets out, and ultimately starves to death? What do you think? Or even if the perpetrator himself removed the ladder before the one whom he pushed could emerge. Well, I push the guy in the pit, and then I take the ladder. Well, now it seems very foreseeable that he's going to end up stuck in that pit and starve to death. Haven't I committed the murder if he ultimately starves to death in that pit if I remove the ladder? But says the Gemara, or even if the perpetrator himself removed the ladder before the one whom he pushed could emerge, causing him to die of starvation, nonetheless, the perpetrator is exempt from execution. We do not impose a court-imposed death penalty on him. And the reason is that at the time that the perpetrator cast this man into the pit, the victim was able to ascend and emerge from the pit. Right? The time that I push him in the pit, there is a ladder there. So the pushing doesn't kill him because there is the possibility at that moment of him getting out. And wait a minute. He was able to ascend and emerge from the pit. Pushing him into the pit did not cause his death. And the removal of the ladder merely prevented the victim from emerging, but it was not an action that directly caused his death. How do we know that another ladder wouldn't come along or a person walk by and throw a rope in, etc.? The causation is too attenuated for us to say the perpetrator is guilty of murder, we will execute him. And Rava says, in the case of one who shot an arrow at another. Okay, there's my guy. I shoot an arrow at him. The arrow kills him. We can all agree I committed murder, right? But he's standing over there. I'm going to shoot an arrow at him. And at the time that I'm shooting my arrow, he has a big shield in front of him, right? Like a Roman shield like they used in the Roman army. Like these guys with their shields right there. Well, if you have a shield like that, yeah, you hide behind that shield. The arrow's not going to kill you. So if I'm shooting an arrow at a guy that has a shield like that, maybe I'm just intending to scare him by making my arrow stick in his shield and let him know, don't come any closer. Right? So in the case of one who shot an arrow at another, and there was a shield in the victim's hand, then if another individual came and took the shield from him, or even if the one who shot the arrow took the shield before the arrow reached the victim. Strange. But let's say that I have a rope attached to his shield. I'm holding the arrow. At the time that I release the arrow, he's got a shield. But between letting the arrow fly and it arriving at the shield, I pull this rope really hard and, remove the shield. Well, doesn't that sound like murder? But no, the chain of causation is broken. And even if I, the one who shoots the arrow, take the shield before the arrow reached him, still the attacker is exempt from execution. And the reason is that at the time that he shot the arrow at the victim, his arrows were blocked from the one being attacked by the shield, and they could not harm him. The victim's death was caused indirectly, not by shooting the arrow, because at that time the arrow wouldn't have harmed him, but rather by the one who removed the shield. And that is an indirect action, since normally removing a shield isn't going to kill anybody. And Rava says, in the case of one who shot an arrow at another, this one I find very hard to understand. Rava says, in the case of one who shot an arrow at another, and the victim had herbs in his possession, capable of healing the wound from the arrow before it became fatal. Then, if another individual came and scattered the herbs, or even if the one who shot the arrow scattered the herbs from before the victim could heal his wound with the herbs, then the attacker is exempt from execution. And the reason is that at the time that he shot the arrow at him, the victim was able to be cured. and the arrow caused injury, but the victim died due to the unavailability of a cure. This would be some kind of powerful herbs that we know predictably could heal someone from any arrow wound. So I think it's much more of a hypothetical. Now Rav Ashi says, it is established that one who shoots an arrow at another is exempt when herbs that could facilitate his recovery are available, as we've just said. Therefore, even if there are herbs available in the marketplace, not in the possession of the victim, the attacker is still exempt from execution, as in that case too, the herbs are available. Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Rav Ashi, if the herbs were not available in the marketplace and herbs capable of healing the wound happened to enter into the victim's possession, yet he neglected to use them and died, then what is the law? And Rav Ashi said to Rav Acha, he emerged from the court innocent, as long as there was a possibility that the victim could heal his wound with the herbs. The one who shot the arrow is not a murderer. Rather, he is merely one who caused death indirectly. And Rava says, in the case of one who threw a stone with the intent to kill another, and the stone caromed off the wall, or caromed off the wall, and rebounded back and killed a different individual, the attacker is liable. So this seems to be a case where I'm throwing a rock at a high speed, right, which predictably could kill someone. Maybe I'm even trying to kill someone, but I miss the guy I'm intending to kill, and I end up, hitting someone else with it. Since I threw a rock with intent to kill, or that predictably could kill, even if it ended up killing someone I was not intending to kill, it sounds like I am liable of murder. And the Tana taught a similar law in a Baraisa. In a case where those who were playing with a ball killed another by hitting him with the rebounding ball, if they did so intentionally, they are executed by beheading. If they did so unwittingly, they are exiled. Now, there's going to be a bunch of teachings here about the ball game in Talmudic times. What? It certainly wasn't baseball. But listen to this note from Rav Steinsaltz. There were several ball games played during the times of the Mishna and the times of the Gemara. Based on the context here, it seems the reference is to a game involving a heavy ball thrown against a wall so that it would bounce a particular distance at a particular angle. Public games throughout antiquity commonly had religious significance. Such games were often violent and sometimes resulted in injury and even the deaths of the players. So the Gemara asks about this ball game, right? Which is like a serious ball that's being thrown around. Now, this is not so crazy. When you think about a major league pitcher throwing a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, I mean, if he just threw that at someone's head who wasn't wearing a helmet, very, very possibly could kill that person, right? But this is sanctioned. This is okay. This is part of the game. Now, obviously, we don't want to see baseball players die, and there's all kinds of safety precautions, so it shouldn't happen. Football, boxing, right? So-called blood sports. I mean, deaths do happen in boxing because you might have a glove on, but you're punching that man in the face as hard as you can with intent to knock him down and knock him out. Right? That could lead to a brain injury and even death. Are we going to say that boxer, who's doing this should be guilty of murder or should be guilty of manslaughter? Or are we going to say, well, no, that's just part of the game and everyone accepts that? Well, see how the Gemara approaches this kind of question. The Gemara asks, if they did so unwittingly, they are exiled. Isn't this obvious? Okay, so he knew that there's the possibility, he's doing something that could kill. He's not intending to kill, but it's going to be considered negligent because he knew that it could kill. So it sounds like, somebody who kills another in the course of a game, we would consider him a manslaughterer, a negligent homicide. And the punishment for that is exile to the city of refuge. all unwitting murderers are exiled. So the Gemara answers, the novel element in this baraisa is not that the unwitting murderer is exiled. Rather, it was necessary for the Tana to teach that if they did so intentionally, they are executed, right? In baseball, the pitcher is not trying to hit the batter in the head, right? He's just trying to strike him out. Sometimes the ball gets away from him. He's throwing it really hard, and he knew that this could happen, and if it ends up killing someone, you could say maybe that's a negligent homicide. On the other hand, if, in the previous inning, a pitcher hurt one of our guys, and now in the next inning, right, that pitcher is now at bat, and our pitcher says, I'm going to show you, and aims at that pitcher's head on purpose. So even though the context is normally where a death would be called a manslaughter, negligent homicide, it might turn into an intentional homicide if we could prove that there was such intent. And this law is needed lest you say that they cannot be executed because the death penalty requires certain forewarning, i.e., forewarning of an action that will certainly lead to the death penalty. And in this case, forewarning is uncertain, as who is to say that the ball will rebound off the wall in this way and cause death. Therefore, the Tana teaches us that those who play ball are trained in throwing it, and the ball will certainly rebound. Therefore, there is no uncertainty, and we can say that if the death happened, it's because they wanted it to happen. There was intent, and you have to prove that he wasn't intentional. Rav Tachlifa from the west, meaning Eretz Yisrael, taught this baraisa before Rabbi Abahu. In a case where those who were playing with a ball killed an individual by hitting him with the ball, if the ball struck the individual within 4 cubits of the one who threw the ball, he is exempt from being exiled, as it was certainly not his intent to throw the ball so short a distance. He didn't know that the guy was going to be there. It's a pure accident. However, if it's beyond 4 cubits, then he is liable to be exiled because he could see the guy and he had the skill to throw at that speed, at that distance, and it starts to look much more like at least a negligent homicide, so he's exiled. Ravina said to Rav Ashi, questioning this law, what are the circumstances? If he was amenable to having the ball travel a short distance, well, then he should be liable even for a throw of less than 4 cubits. And if he was not amenable to having the ball travel the distance that it traveled, it was not intentional at all, then he should not be liable even for a throw greater than 4 cubits. So in what case is the measure of 4 cubits significant? And Rabbi Bahu said to him, with regard to ordinary people who play with a ball, the farther they enter and approach the wall, the more amenable they are to the result, as the ball caroms off the wall and rebounds further. Therefore, presumably, their intent was that the ball would travel a distance greater than 4 cubits. Again, they're examining the circumstances of this throw, the skill level of the player, what went down. Was it pure accident? Was it something that he should have known could cause harm, or did he do it intentionally? The Gemara questions the principle underlying this law. Is that to say that in a case like this, when an item caroms off the wall, the action is considered the result of his force? And the Gemara raises meaning like it really was him who caused it? And the Gemara raises a contradiction from a Mishna. In the case of one who sanctifies the waters of purification by placing the ashes of the red heifer into the water, in order to sprinkle one impure with impurity imparted by a corpse. Right. So in other words, we've seen that when the temple was standing, before a person could enter the temple, if he had come into contact with a human corpse or walked over a grave, for that matter, he would have to be purified with the waters of purification. What were the waters of purification? In all of Jewish history, there were 9 red heifers, right, over a 1,000-year period. Those red heifers, when they came, they were slaughtered on a special platform on the Mount of Olives opposite the eastern entrance of the Holy Temple. And then it was burned in a special pyre made with cedar and hyssop wood and other stuff. And then all this mixture of ashes of the red heifer and that wood was collected. And then some of those ashes would be mixed with pure water from a running stream. And now you have the waters of purification. Now that waters of purification could be used to purify from corpse tuma, right? Impurity from a human corpse. whether that impurity was on a person or on a vessel, as we're going to discuss in a moment. But the point is that when you were creating the waters of purification, the ashes had to be placed in the water with the intent to put those ashes in the water. What if the ashes just kind of fell in that water? Were waters of purification created? That's what's being asked here. Right? In the case of one who sanctifies the waters of purification by placing the ashes of the red heifer into the water in order to sprinkle on one impure with impurity imparted by a corpse, and the sacred ashes fell on his hand or on the side of the vessel, and only thereafter it fell into the water that's in that trough. So the purification waters are unfit. You didn't create waters of purification because there is a requirement that the ashes must be placed in the water intentionally by the force of the one creating the waters of purification. And likewise, when an item caroms off a wall, the action is not generated by the force of his action, rather by the wall that redirects that ball, and therefore he should not be liable. But the Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a case where the ashes trickle from his hand or from the sides of the vessel into the water, a slow movement that is not generated by the force of his action. This is in contrast to the case where he throws a ball off the wall. Yeah, the ball was redirected by the wall when it bounced off the wall, but the ball was traveling at a high speed because he threw it, right, with his force. And it's that same force that, sent the ball, admittedly, redirected by bouncing off the wall, but then into a person and killed him. How can you say that's not the force of his throw? The Gemara suggests, come in here, a proof that only an action that one generates directly is considered the force of his action. As it is taught in a Mishna concerning a needle, so this is an instrument, a utensil, that was impure with impurity imparted by a corpse, right? A needle that came into contact with a human corpse. Can't use it until it's purified. It's going to need to be purified with the waters of purification, right? This pure water into which some ashes of the red heifer were mixed when the temple was standing. So concerning a needle that was impure with impurity imparted by a corpse, and it was placed on an earthenware shard, and one sprinkled the water of purification. So if there is uncertainty whether he actually sprinkled the purification water on the needle, or whether he sprinkled the water on the earthenware shard, and then the water inadvertently flowed across the shard and came into contact with the needle, so it was not his force directly putting water of purification on the iron needle. So in that case, the needle is unfit, right? In other words, he hasn't purified the needle unless he immerses the needle in the waters of purification or he sprinkles the waters of purification directly on the needle. If he sprinkles it somewhere else, even though he started the chain of events by sprinkling the water and then it ran along the shard and then it touched the needle, nonetheless, he did not purify that needle. So it seems like, by analogy, if you throw a ball and it bounces off a wall and then it kills someone, that bounce off the wall broke the chain of causation and you're not liable. Rav Chinana Bar Yehuda said in the name of Rav, Imen the Mishnah, sprayed, mitzah, was not stated in the Mishnah. Found, matzah, was stated. That is, it was found that the needle was wet, and it is not clear whether it was wet from purification water that was sprinkled directly upon it or from water that dripped from the earthenware onto the needle. This case is not comparable to the case of one who throws a ball off the wall, where we know that the ball traveled because he threw it, bounced off the wall, and then killed someone. Rav Papa says, with regard to this one who bound another and diverted a flow of water upon him and he died, the water is tantamount to his arrows that were effective in committing the murder, and he is liable. And this matter applies only in a case where he killed the other individual by primary force, as the individual was near to him and was directly drowned by the water. But if the individual was farther away and was killed by a secondary force after the water flowed on its own, it is not his action, rather it is merely an indirect action, and he is exempt. I'm thinking, there's a person tied to railroad tracks, right? And there's what do you call it? A fork in the train tracks, right? So the train is going to go straight down the track, and there's a person tied to the railroad track, on this spur off to the side. So if no action is taken, the train will just go straight, and that person will not be harmed. So someone comes along and changes the track from the straight, which won't cause harm, to now the train is directed on that spur where it will run over this person who was bound on the track. So at the time that somebody bound a human and left him on the tracks, the train wasn't scheduled to go there. It wasn't going to kill him. And then somebody diverted the train. Who committed murder if the train runs over that bound person? Right? Unclear. That's what they're arguing about here. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And recall that in about half an hour at 1:30 today, we'll do our annual live reading of the Megillah. Because it's Purim, we're going to read it in English. And if donations come in during that time to our organization, Accidental Talmudist, we will, flow through us and we'll make gifts to the poor. Matanos Levyonim, which is one of the mitzvahs of Purim. Give gifts to the poor, give gifts to your friend, have the Purim Suda, and hear the Megillah being read, which should be read in Hebrew from a scroll. But also we can discuss, the story a little bit as we go through it. So 1:30 live on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. We'll add that this year. And Rav Papa says, in a case where one threw a stone upward and it went to the side and killed an individual, he is liable. That reminds me of something that happens in LA every year, New Year's Eve. People shoot guns in the air. So if you shoot a gun in the air, that bullet is going to go up a long way, and then gravity will stop it, and the bullet will come down at a very high rate of speed. And people get hurt or even killed every year from that. Is the guy who shot a bullet up in the air liable when that bullet comes down and kills someone? Sounds like, yeah. And Rav Papa says, in a case where one threw a stone upward and it went to the side and it killed an individual, he is liable. And Mar, the son of Rav Ashi, said to Rav Papa, what is the reason that you say he is liable? Is it due to the fact that the result is generated by the force of his action? He threw the rock up in the air. It came down. Maybe he didn't think it was going to come down over there and kill somebody. He thought it was going to come here, but he threw the rock up in the air. But he says, Mar, the son of Rav Ashi, is it due to the fact that the result is generated by the force of his action? That cannot be. As if it is generated by the force of his action, the stone should go directly upward where he threw it, and not to the side. So Rav Papa answered, and were it not for the force of his action, the stone would go down and not to the side. Rather, although it is a weak force, the force of his action is a partial cause of the damage caused by the stone going to the side, and therefore he is liable. It's interesting that they never use the word foreseeability, which I brought up a lot, maybe because I went to law school, but isn't that the underlying issue? He threw the rock. He knew it was going to come down somewhere, right? And even though he didn't think it would come down there, he threw the rock. What's interesting is they're saying liable for murder. Maybe it should have been negligent homicide, but we're not there yet. And at the top of 78a, the sages taught, if 10 people struck an individual with 10 sticks, and as a result of the beating, the victim died, whether they beat him simultaneously or whether they beat him one after the other, they are exempt from liability for killing him, as two people are not liable for an action that they performed together. In other words, we don't know who really killed him. So we can't assign a death penalty for murder to any one of those 10 people, since each individually, probably hit him in a way that wouldn't have killed him. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says if they struck him one after the other, not all at the same time, then the one who struck him last is liable because he hastened his death. Rabbi Yochanan says, and both rabbis, i.e. the first Tana and Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, interpreted the same verse In drawing their halakhic conclusion, the verse states, and a man who strikes any soul mortally, he shall be put to death. Leviticus 24:17. The rabbis hold that any soul means that one is liable for murder only when there is an entire soul, i.e., when the murderer alone is responsible for taking the entire life of the victim. Not where he contributed to something, but we don't know, we can't assign the guilt for murder to any one of the mob, that's set on someone and all with their beating killed him. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera holds that any soul means that one is liable for murder for taking any soul, even if the victim had already been beaten and was close to death, right? And by the way, this is the reason why, somebody is like on his deathbed, taking his last breaths, and you go over and close his eyes before he's dead, you can be guilty of murder because you hastened the death, right? We don't do that. We don't hasten a death. There's a lot of complexity there. What about just making somebody comfortable at the time of their death? Well, making somebody comfortable is not the same as hastening the death. Hastening a death is considered murder. We don't do that. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let me take some questions. The hour is late. We'll keep it moving. Sharon, I used to work on a hospital spinal cord injury unit in Philadelphia, predominantly populated by street gang injured folks. I learned a lot about street justice there. Whew, I bet there were some colorful stories. Wow. Renee, popsicle stick in the eye could cause a problem. I had a case in which my off-duty cop was moonlighting at a teen dance and caught a fake fingernail in the eye. The fingernail had disattached from its wearer in a fight and flew into the eye of my guy who was trying to break up the fight. It scratched his cornea. Eggshell eyeball. Wow. But I think what's really, I think what you're alluding to very colorfully and accurately is the world is funny and unpredictable. Stuff happens, right? If something can splash here or be deflected there, bounce there, carom here, stuff happens, And it's almost like the famous, I'm not going to go there. That'll take too long. Tom, A pushes B into the pit. B suffers an injury and he can't climb up the ladder. B dies. Then C comes along and sees a ladder, but not a body. And he thinks, ooh, a ladder. I need a ladder right now. And he takes the ladder. Who gets charged with what? I guess you're saying that B dies, but at the time that C took the ladder, C was not dead yet. Oh, no, you say he doesn't see the body. I mean, if the one's already dead, the one who took a ladder, maybe he's charged with theft, but there's definitely no relationship. If B hasn't died yet when C takes the ladder, it sounds like still he didn't push him in. He's not holding him down from getting out. I don't know. It's tricky. I think that we're going to need to have more facts. But I think the general theme here is that the sages are going to be very reticent to impose a death penalty unless there is clearly direct causation leading to murder. And finally, Tom, but did the archer know that? He presumably intended to kill or at least hurt someone with reckless disregard for the victim's life, right? At the time that he fires the arrow, does he know that the shield is there? Does he know that the shield is going to remain there? Certainly, I think probably American jurisprudence on this question of foreseeability, maybe like the simplest case is when kids throw rocks off a overpass, because they think it's funny, and then it crashes into somebody's windshield, and they, swerve out of control. There's a terrible accident, people die, right? Is that murder? Is that murder? The kids thought they were being funny. They're stupid. They don't think things through. They probably didn't think they were killing someone. They certainly took an action that it was foreseeable could end up in a death. I'm guessing that under American law, that's probably going to be a manslaughter. under this law, certainly not going to be murder, I don't think, unless they throw the rock off, not with intent to kill someone, but it actually lands on a person's head and kills him. Then it sounds like that would be murder. But lands on someone's wagon, the horse goes crazy, veers off, hits another wagon that then veers off, and somebody, falls off the bridge and drowns in a river. Certainly the chain of causation is broken. Is it still there for manslaughter, or is it just pure accident? I don't think we have clear principles yet. So we're going to continue this journey. I wish we could continue it tomorrow night after Shabbos, but I'll be on a red eye to Florida for the screening on Sunday. So as I mentioned at the beginning of class, no class Sunday, a Saturday night, Sunday, and Monday, and we will resume AT Daily on Tuesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Purim Sameach.